Hey everyone, welcome back to Sewing with Sin. The last video that I just posted was, I wanted to show you 100 acts of sewing shirt number 1. And I wanted to show you, I'm making another one really quick because they're so fast and easy to make. And I want a few of them for the summer. So I wanted to show you the one that I'm working on right now because I'm gonna do French seams on them, which in her instructions, she has directions for French seams. You could also do zigzag stitching if you're closing the seams, but I decided to try something a little different. So I thought I would bring you along and show you how I'm doing it. And then also in my last video for shirt number 1, I wasn't able to upload the video that showed the process for finishing the seams on the neckline with bias tape facing. Unfortunately, it got all of the videos that I had made got deleted when I made a phone transfer. So I have to do it all over again. So I thought, well, I'm gonna make this shirt number 1 and I'm gonna take you along today to show you how to do French seams. And then later on, I'll work on the neckline and upload that video coming next. So let me show you what I've done so far and I'm gonna bring you along for the next step. All right, when you're making French seams, instead of sewing right sides together, because normally when you're sewing something, you put the right side of the shirt facing the other right side of the shirt. And when you sew it, it would look something like this. You would sew it along the inside. But when you're doing French seams, it's kind of like the opposite. So I'm gonna put wrong sides together of my shirt and matching the shoulder seams, match those shoulder seams. And what you're gonna do is take it over to your machine and sew a straight stitch across that shoulder seam, not at 1/2 inch seam allowance, you're gonna do it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So the reason why you're doing it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance instead of a 1/2 inch is because you're also gonna sew a little bit more and flip it inside out in just a little bit. So this right here is a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then what I'm gonna do next, sorry, I already did that step without you, so you didn't get to see me. But now what I'm gonna do next is I'm gonna trim this down. I'm gonna grade it. That's what it means when you trim it down. So right now I'm at a 1/4 inch, I don't know if you could see that. I'm at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm gonna grade it down to an 1/8 inch seam allowance, which is just like half that size. So you could measure it, you don't have to, but I know that like when I put this against my shirt, that's about how much I'm gonna grade. That's about how much I'm gonna cut off. So I'm gonna go through and do that on both shoulder seams. I'm not totally measuring it. I'm just trying to stay in the middle of where the stitch is at and the edge of the fabric. So this is what it looks like when I'm taking it off. And that should be about an 1/8 inch seam allowance now that I've trimmed it. And I'm gonna do the same to the other. And this is just the shoulder seams yet. I haven't worked on the side seams of the shirt yet. So don't sew up those sides yet because you're gonna be flipping the shirt inside out right now. Okay, and then next step is we're gonna go over to the ironing board or wherever your ironing spot is at. And you're gonna open this up and we're gonna iron those seams towards the back of the shirt. Right now, I don't really know where the back of the shirt is yet because I haven't cut my neckline, so it doesn't really matter. I'm just gonna iron them both in one direction. Let me take you over there. Now I'm gonna press that seam towards one side. Since I haven't done the neckline yet, it doesn't matter which side. But if you had already cut the neckline, you would press it towards the back of the shirt. So I'm pressing it towards one side. I'm gonna do the same with the other shoulder seam that I just sewed up right now. So I pressed it toward this side. I'm gonna do the same on the other shoulder. Just make sure you're ironing it the same direction for both seams. Then flip it over to the other side And just press it down one more time just to make sure that it's nice and crisp on both sides. Make sure that that seam is still facing whatever side that you ironed it on to begin with. Same thing with the other side. This actually, I feel like, is easier than zigzag stitch. I probably should have done this on my first shirt. Then you're gonna fold it along this crease. So there's a crease right here, all along there. You're gonna fold it right along that crease. And iron that down. So I'm ironing it down right on that crease. And I'm gonna press that because next step is we're gonna take it over to the sewing machine to sew it down one more time. So we're closing up the seams now. Hot! Okay, so here's what that looks like. The seam is right there along the middle and I ironed it. I'm gonna do that for the other side too. Make sure that so I'm just kind of finger pressing it before I do it with the iron to make sure that everything's right along that seam line. Okay, now you're gonna take it over to your ironing machine. Ironing machine? What? You're gonna take it over to your sewing machine. All right, you really don't even need to pin anything down. It should be nice and crisp and ironed. And you're gonna this is where my neckline is at, so I'm starting at the neckline. And I'm gonna put it in at the machine, not at 1/2 inch seam allowance. That's what you would have done if you sewed it without a French seam. So I'm gonna go back to a 1/4 inch seam allowance because you did a 1/4 inch on this opposite side. And now you're gonna do another 1/4 inch, which will equal a 1/2 inch total. See how that math comes in handy? I guess it was important to learn a little bit of math. Don't forget to forward and back stitch. And I'm just checking to make sure that the seam is always at a 1/4 inch as I'm sewing it. And then don't forget to back stitch. Trim that, and you're going to do it again to the other side. I'm not going to show you that, but I will show you what it looks like now that I'm done. So now here's what the interior of the shirt will look like. Look how nice and clean that looks. And then when I fold it over to the opposite side, voila, look how beautiful that looks. A nice, crisp, clean seam. Now you're gonna take this over to the ironing board again, and I'm just turning mine on again and getting it warm. You're gonna iron that seam towards wherever the back of your shirt is. So for me, I'm just gonna choose to go that way when I press it. And that means that this little seam right here is gonna be flat down like that. That's the final step. Let me take you over to show you that. Okay, I have it laid out with the right side facing down, and I'm just gonna fold this little extra piece of material from the seam towards the left. So for me, that's gonna be the back of my shirt. So whenever I cut the neckline, I'll remember to cut this side of the shirt because this side is gonna be the back of my shirt. So just keep that in mind whenever you start working on the neckline later on. And then do the same thing to the other side. Make sure you're pressing it the same way. To me, it looks like, to you, it might look like the opposite because I just flipped it over, but I'm actually pressing it the same way. I'm pulling slightly over here to make sure that it's flush right next to the neckline. And there you have it. That is way faster to me than zigzag stitching it, closing those seams. This is what the shoulder looks like on the outside. And then now that you're done with your shoulders, you're gonna line up. This is the step that you didn't see me do before because I did it on my own. You're gonna line up the sleeve of the top, and pin it all around. And after you're done pinning it, you're gonna sew a straight stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then you're gonna grade, which means trim that excess fabric to an 1/8 inch seam allowance, and then you're gonna fold it inside out, iron it down. You're basically doing all the same steps that you did at the shoulder seams. Iron it down and take it over to the sewing machine and sew it again at 1/4 inch seam allowance. I just want to say one last thing too. So here's what all that looks like pinned, and I'm going to go and iron that at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And one last thing I wanted to say. Okay, I wanted to give you a quick tip because I remember when I was doing French seams one time, I chose not to grade the excess fabric. Remember how I did that? And I graded it down to an 1/8 inch seam allowance right now. If you do not do that and you get to this step when you're on the inside of the top and you're sewing it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, what's gonna happen is when you turn it right side out like this, you're gonna see a piece of that fabric that you didn't grade sticking out. So just make sure not to skip that step. I don't know why I skipped it a long time ago when I did that. Maybe I was just being lazy. Maybe I thought that when I was sewing the seam it would be enough space to cover it, but it was not. And then I had to unpick everything. So I just wanted to give you that helpful tip to make sure that you grade your seams before you flip it right side out and sew and close everything up. And I'm gonna do this. I'm just gonna speed it up though, and I'm gonna show you this process on this side, and then I'm gonna do the other side on my own, and I'll see you back around when I work on the neckline. Thanks again for joining me. If you have any questions or if something felt unclear or rushed, please leave me a message in the comments, or you can reach out to me and find me on Instagram under I am Sewing Sin. I'll also link that down there in the comments below.